This video was sponsored by Squarespace.
What's up guys, and welcome to this video today. My name's Grant Stevens, and in this one I'm going to be doing something a little bit different to the regular type of content that I produce on this channel. And what that is I've been helping Adam for a little while to improve his boxing and martial arts techniques. So what this video is going to consist of is me analysing some of the training footage that Adam initially sent me when we started doing this work together. And I'm going to highlight in detail all of the different areas and nuances that I noticed he could improve on, which I think will be really helpful for you guys in the audience as well if you're training in something similar. And then what we're going to do is contrast that against more recent footage that Adam sent me where he's begun to implement some of the things I suggested all the way up until more of the present day. And when you see this more recent footage, I'm sure you'll agree that these improvements have been absolutely massive. So me and Adam bonded over a love of martial arts and had really similar interests in terms of things like video games, anime, and we've always had a really great time when we've been able to get together in person and actually do some training together. And to Adam's credit as well, all of these improvements haven't been achieved through extensively working together either. We've only actually trained together in person a handful of times, and that was usually actually for shooting video footage, so it wasn't really training focused anyway. And outside of that, all I've done was just a couple of screen recordings highlighting where improvements could be made. And so really the vast majority of the improvements that you're about to see in this video have been through Adam just taking on board what I've said and then really putting that work in to develop his techniques. So Adam's martial arts background is relatively different to mine in that he'd only really trained in traditional styles, those being predominantly Wado Ryu, Karate and Wing Chun. And we can absolutely see these influences in this early footage. But before we dive into analysing the actual training footage, it's really important for me to first make the distinction between what's considered to be a person's unique style and the way they move versus what is considered to be good and sound technique. So even if, for example, you took two people and they did exactly the same training for the same length of time, their techniques are always going to be slightly different because of things like unique body types, limb lengths, muscular development in certain areas, etc. And all of those different factors influence how that person uniquely moves. And so individual style certainly exists, and in fact it's better to work with what feels natural for you to do within your own unique body. But regardless of anyone's unique movement, there are absolutely some omnipresent principles that underlie what we could consider to be technical proficiency, and they go beyond what is considered style. With punching, for instance, one of those would be having your feet firmly rooted into the ground when you execute a punch and rotating through the hips and shoulders in order to deliver power. And I say that because a lot of people's egos can get hurt and they'll try to claim things like, but this is just my style and way of doing it, as a sort of excuse to not have to put the work in to make their techniques better. So regardless of your own stylistic choices and idiosyncrasies, the way you execute a technique should always be conducive to delivering power. And if you're punching without rotating through the body, for instance, and claiming that's a style, then that's simply not understanding what is good technique. There are no elite boxers, for instance, that don't have good power transfer through their body due to their style, because that's one of those foundational principles. Or you can't deliver a decent head kick without pivoting sufficiently on the standing foot, which is another one. So style is more like how the person moves in their stance, the natural resting position of their hands, for instance, and how this changes during their strikes. So what any decent coach should do isn't try to create a clone of what they consider to be textbook movement in their student. Rather, they should aim to improve the speed, power and efficiency of that student's technique through those foundational principles, and that will naturally fit into their own unique style. So when we begin to look at this footage, straight off the bat I noticed a number of improvements that could be made. And I think the best way to describe Adam's movement here is that it doesn't look natural and he has poor economy of motion. So economy of motion refers to the process of refining your technique over time via stripping any unnecessary movements from it, therefore making it more efficient. The aim is the shortest motion and the quickest route to the objective using the least strength, and this results in the technique that will achieve the fastest and easiest result. Now this sounds kind of a bit harsh, but I joked that Adam's movement here in this early footage looks kind of like a really old beat-em-up game before the developers began to use motion capture where they had to guesswork animate how a real boxer might move. And in terms of the well-known competency hierarchy, you could say in this early footage Adam's at a stage of unconscious incompetence and is unable to recognise the deficits in his own movements and techniques. So we'll begin with Adam's stance and general posture. Now the first thing I notice here is that he's very straight backed a lot of the time, and what I mean by that is there's a lack of what I call the hollow body position going on, which is how we have strong composure. And the hollow body position looks like this, and it's the position you should aim to maintain when you're striking. And this position is one of the key fundamentals in striking prowess and is really beyond any one technique, but simultaneously is applicable in all of them and has a knock-on effect to the efficiency of execution. The opposite of this would be flexing the spine backwards, which is something many people don't realise they're doing when they move, and we can see again in some of this footage at times Adam's in a similar anti-hollow position. And this is super important because if you unconsciously fall out of that composed hollow position when you're striking, then you're drastically reducing the amount of power you're able to put into your actual techniques, particularly in terms of efficiency in the kinetic chain. And that's the way we utilise the energetic potential that begins in the legs and then travels up through the body and finally discharges into the the strike. And the stronger your composure during this process, the more of that potential energy is transmuted, resulting in greater power. Further to that, Adam's resting guard is also questionable. I think he's probably been told to keep his hands up, but you can tell it's not something that's habitual, and he moves them around a lot unnecessarily in between strikes. He's also very bouncy in his stance and appears quite tense and stiff at times. Now, it's good to be light on your feet, but not constantly, because when you strike, your feet must be rooted and balanced in order to apply power and transfer energy into the punches. In terms of the actual strikes, one of the biggest habits that we had to break was that because of his karate background, Adam's got a tendency to punch from the waist, kind of like you would do in a kata. I remember during times we've worked on this stuff in person together, this was possibly the thing I had to point out to him the most, as he just kept naturally going back to that habitual way of doing it. Now, because of that, you can see here how the vast majority of his punches strike the target very low down, which leaves him incredibly vulnerable, as all of this area is basically an open target, which is made worse by the fact that he also drops his non-striking hand completely, meaning he's got no protection against a counter-attack. If you're enjoying this video so far, guys, please head to my channel, that is youtube.com/GrantStevensMA, and subscribe. I dive into this stuff in much greater detail and provide a lot of training methodologies that you can utilise in order to improve your own martial arts training. The next thing is that there's very limited, if any, rotation through the body into the strikes, particularly his cross, which is the key to applying power in the kinetic chain, as already discussed. This begins early in the movement if the practitioner doesn't pivot on the ball of their rear foot, lifting the heel off the ground, which then results in it not being possible for them to get the rest of their body into optimal alignment. Now, this is something everyone struggles to get to grips with when they begin boxing or martial arts training, and when a coach picks them up on it, initially it can feel very unnatural and like you're having to rotate way further than you were previously comfortable. But over time this will become second nature and starts to make much more sense, especially in terms of applying your weight behind the punches. As a knock-on effect to this lack of rotation, Adam also leans in way too close to the target when he needs to close the distance, again leaving him vulnerable, and this is made worse by that too much bounciness and lack of groundedness before striking. And you can see in many of these combos how Adam's continually moving forwards while he's still actually executing multiple punches when he really should be rooted on the ground, and if the bag wasn't there to stop him, he'd likely fall off balance by doing this. Now, despite this though, because of his already existing high level of strength, Adam's still able to apply a good deal of force to the target, but because this power is coming from raw strength and muscular force, it becomes exhausting quickly. Sometimes having a high level of prior ability can be good, but it can also sometimes be bad. Good in that the person is used to working with their body and has good muscular control, and bad in the sense that using a lot of muscular force can actually allow you to get away with thinking you're doing the right thing, when actually there's a much more efficient way to do it. So one of the keys to efficient martial arts performance is remaining as relaxed as possible during all of your movements, and not expending 1 ounce more energy than is absolutely necessary. Everybody gets tired, but it's the people that are able to manage that fatigue and still perform anyway that prevail. And Adam will tell you himself that one of the biggest hindrances he ran up against when we've sparred together was rapid fatigue. Lastly, something else I wanted Adam to begin doing was to turn his hand over more, as he had a tendency to punch more vertically. And this is certainly a valid way of punching and is heavily utilised in styles like Wing Chun, but I wanted him to begin to work in more of a boxing style with the hand horizontal, which necessitates pushing through the shoulder by projecting it forward as the arm is straightened. So the straight punches and combos were the primary thing we'd focused upon improving, but I'll just touch upon some of the round kicks now, as these have also improved a great deal in the recent clips. You can see that these roundhouse kicks have very little power because there's no hip rotation in them, and so essentially they're moving at an upward angle and glancing the target rather than slamming straight into it and through it. And this happens because of an issue at the very start of the kick. His non-kicking leg and foot is not pivoting enough, and when you don't pivot enough, this has a knock-on effect of it being relatively impossible to position your body in a way that is conducive to kicking with power, because you're unable to align the hips to then drive through the target. So what I'd basically done when me and Adam were working together is I'd made a screen recording, kind of like I did in the previous section, highlighting some of the things that he could improve upon. And the next lot of footage we're going to be looking at is where Adam had begun to implement some of that stuff. So although there are huge improvements over those first clips, you can still tell that it's not yet very natural and it doesn't quite look right. It could be said that he's almost overcooking the rotation at some times, because now he's aware that he needs to do that. But this is still a massive improvement and is a completely normal thing. There's always a stage like this when you begin to implement changes to something when you're still quite in your head and having to think about what you're doing each time, and you're likely to over-implement some of those changes. And this is where I would say he's beginning to bridge the gap between conscious incompetency, recognizing how many mistakes he's making, and conscious competency, where he's beginning to work upon correcting those mistakes through self-awareness and practice. And we can see here how he's rotating through the hips and shoulders more, so that cross comes out more forwardly projected, and because of that his understanding of range has improved along with it. He no longer walks towards the target when punching and remains in position, and although there is still some leaning issues going on here, he's closing the distance between himself and the bag using rotation and extension of the punch vastly more than in the previous footage. Although there is still a degree of bodily tension present, it's far less than the original footage, resulting in a greater level of fluidity and flow in the movements. And the advice I would give at this stage is is still mainly focused upon trying to be a little less straight backed once again, but there was massive improvement over the early clips in that as well. On top of that, the general guard has improved, however Adam still has a tendency to drop the non-punching hand too low sometimes. Again, going back to that more karate style, but this isn't something that he always does. You can notice that when Adam executes 4 straight consecutive punches, he doesn't drop that arm as much because he's subconsciously aware he needs to keep it up in order to execute the next punch in that sequence. So the tendency when refining a skill as you rise through those levels of competency and naturalness is you may firstly struggle to only get 1 or 2 in 10 executed soundly, but with more training that then goes to 3 out of 10, then 4. But as this number rises, the time frame is not linear by any means. So getting 1 in 10 might take just a few mindful repetitions, but then you fall back into old habits. You practice a little bit more and then you're able to execute a couple like this, perhaps over 1 or 2 training sessions, and that might take a week or so. But to get to almost copy-paste execution of a technique with consistency takes a really long time and a lot of practice. So I always tell people who are wishing to develop skill like this in something to expect that from the outset in order to avoid disappointment. So now we're going to be analysing the most recent footage that Adam sent me, and I'm sure you'll agree that there's just a night and day difference between this footage and those original clips. The main thing I noticed is how much more efficiently he's able to apply his strength and power into the punches now, and you don't have to be savvy to the intricacies of striking technique to notice this. The whole aura is far more aggressive and dominant towards the target, and you can see how he's utilising the kinetic chain way more efficiently now, unleashing much more of his energy into the punches. It's evident that Adam's really worked upon keeping the hands high throughout the combos now as well, and has much less of a tendency to drop the non-punching arm, which has massively contributed to his efficiency and the overall aesthetic of the movement. His understanding of range has also improved a lot now too, although I would still consider him to be a little out of range with some of these punches, which is causing him to still lean in slightly. He's not falling off balance as he was before, or suddenly finishing a sequence only to find himself right on top of the target as we saw previously. In terms of advice moving forward, I think Adam would do well to begin adding a lot more volume of strikes into his bag work and moving around the target more fluidly in a relaxed manner, which would help with his overall agility. You can see here how he throws almost all of these strikes with a really aggressive force, but you also want to be able to relax and utilise other throwaway shots in order for the positioning to set up the heavier blows. One thing I would certainly suggest Adam work upon going forward are his rotational punches like these hooks, which we hadn't really focused upon during our work together. Because of this, they still have a lot of the characteristics of the old Adam, such as punching more from the waist, hitting low and knocking him off balance. Hook punch, especially the lead hook, is possibly the most technically difficult technique to master, so that's what I'd like to help him with next. So that concludes the most recent clips that Adam sent me, and I think if Adam continues to refine and work upon these techniques, then his punching is going to become incredibly formidable, because although he's got a lot of muscle mass, he can move it around incredibly well because of his super functional training approach and philosophy, in which he utilises a vast array of training methods to develop strength and performance. Now this is something that me and Adam had worked upon together, but if you want to do this yourself, then you certainly can do that as well. What I would suggest is a couple of things. Firstly, you want to make sure that you're watching a lot of combat athletes moving, or anyone who's very technically proficient in a skill that you wish to improve in, because that's going to activate mirror neurons, which is how we learn by watching. And then when you go into training, I would always just do a little bit of filming as well. So you only have to film yourself for like 15 seconds or something like that, performing a range of different techniques. And you can compare that to the person you aspire to move like and make those refinements every time you go and train. And then when you do actually go into your training, the main thing is that you need to be very mindful of what you're doing so that you can implement those changes, especially if you're used to doing something a certain way prior, because you're naturally going to go back to that habitual way of doing things, which might not be the most optimal. I suggest doing this by starting really slowly and purposefully moving through the movements, paying attention to what you're doing at each stage, and then building speed and power as you go from there. Alright guys, I really hope you enjoyed this one. Like I said, something a little bit different, but if you did like it, please just leave a comment and let me know. And also head over to my channel, youtube.com/GrantStevensMA, for similar content to this, and I'll see you in the next video.
By the way guys, this video was sponsored by Squarespace. So Squarespace is a website building platform that allows anyone to build a website extremely easily by just dragging and dropping elements onto the page wherever they might want them. This lets you build a website in minutes rather than days and weeks and months. There's no need to hire an expensive web development team, and at the same time you have access to all the features you might need no matter how big your business eventually grows. If I was starting out a website today, I would definitely use Squarespace. In fact, I am beginning a new project right as we speak, and Squarespace is what I'm going to use to build it. This is because it just makes things simpler and easier. When I first launched the Bioneer and started selling products from the site, I remember being extremely excited when I got loads and loads of pre-orders. However, I then had a technical issue that meant that lots of those pre-orders got lost and I had to stay up all night sending each product individually to each person who'd bought it. It was an extreme amount of stress, I didn't know what was going wrong, and it would just have been much, much easier to use a platform where everything just works for you. There's tons of amazing templates you can pick from and then customize to your liking. And then from there you can add things like e-commerce, like I mentioned. You've got advanced formatting tools for making beautiful blog posts and then publishing them or scheduling them for later. You've got a fully integrated commenting system with threaded comments, replies and likes, analytics, social media integration. And then if you want even more features, you can use the huge selection of plugins that come from Squarespace themselves and the community. And that includes things like global tracking and inventory management for e-commerce and many, many, many more features. So if you want to find out more, then head over to squarespace.com. And if you want to give it a go, then head over to squarespace.com/Bioneer and you get 10% off your first domain or website. Thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Thanks to you guys for watching, and bye for now.